on the other, whites are told to rejoice and celebrate as it's a good thing that we become a minority. So when Europeans landed on these shores, why didn't the American Indians embrace diversity and rejoice in becoming a minority? Why did they resist? And although it can be debated who was first, how did being a minority work out for American Indians? Or how about the Palestinians or the Yazidis? Well, if you ask someone, why is it good for white people to become a minority in America and now talks of it in Europe too? They say because of colonialism. So they admit it's revenge. It's hate for what they think happened hundreds of years ago. But now it's okay for people today who had nothing to do with what happened hundreds of years ago to colonize white people today. But of course, they have to use our tax dollars to do it. Yet in white countries, so-called minorities have it real good. So good that now white people are trying to pass as one. If you can prove you are more oppressed by whites, then the more gibs and attention you will get. If you're a minority in a white country, you can cash in on affirmative action, special loans, grants, scholarships, jobs, casting calls, diversity programs, all because you are not white. Non-stop, we hear, oh, the oppression of Muslims and Jews and gays and blacks and every other non-white group, but white people should rejoice in becoming a minority? The difference is, each one of these groups I mentioned are a protected class under hate speech laws. Who's the one group you can criticize? Whites and Christians, hardly supremacists. You can make them bake your gay cake and you can literally murder a white person because they are white while saying, fuck white people, and it's not a hate crime and not racist because only white people can be racist. So Whitey, considering hostile groups in America like La Raza, BLM, Islamic haters, and non-whites who have been programmed by anti-white Marxists to resent us and blame us for all their shortcomings, how do you think you will be treated as a minority?
You just saw a clip from Red Ice TV. I know I've visited Red Ice TV on this channel many times. But the reason I do that is because there's not a lot of channels calling them out. Some channels that call out SJWs deem Red Ice negligible. Meaning, it's like why they don't do call-outs of Alex Jones, supposedly, that these people are kooks. And no one buys into their narrative. And they're not a threat. And they'll never gain steam. And they'll never gain power. Which is funny because they're in power in the United States of America right now. The brain of the Trump administration shares all of these real victims, talking points, these privileged minority, anti-SJW talking points that history is over and we have to be instant egalitarians. Reparations are unjustified, even though it used to be illegal in this country from its founding right into, if you include Jim Crow, the mid-20th century, for non-white people to acquire wealth legally. For women, white women even, in the early 20th century, maybe around the suffragette era, they couldn't even work. So history's over now, like there's no reason to, you know, this anti-justice narrative that the alt-right champions is so old and so familiar and so reactionary to stuff like Barack Obama being elected president. Any kind of progress that disadvantage people, whether it's women making progress, there's backlash about feminists having too much power. You know what I mean? So Hillary Clinton becomes the candidate for president, and you immediately get like this backlash about how all of our institutions have been corrupted by feminist theory and this term, this profoundly absurd term. It's funny that the people who make their kind of communities around the idea that patriarchy doesn't exist has actually adopted the idea of gynocracy. This is like more real victim shit. You'll still get people like Lana Lokteff talking about how immigrants, economic migrants, are somehow a insurgent force. That they're coming here with the intention of fucking white people out of existence, or at least fucking white people out of the majority of their nation's populations, which is on one hand like extremely paranoid, but also when you think about it, economic migrants are usually casualties of neoliberal capitalism. You could go all the way back to colonialism, but let's try to stick within 20th century reasons for economic migration, right? So Lana Lokteff says, that whites are being forced to surrender their land. And she talks about, what's funny about these alt-righters is they talk about slavery like slavery's over. Like the fucking people picking their fruit, picking their crops aren't brown people. Like the people, I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. The idea that black prisoners are not slaves is so fucking semantic. It's like a grotesque peak in like making a semantic argument that someone who gets paid 10 cents an hour to do $10 an hour worth of work is not a slave. Just because you pay somebody doesn't mean that they're not a proper slave. The people working at Foxconn making your iPhones are working 17-hour days and making like $1.50 a day, and they're committing suicide because being a slave is torture. And it does not seem like the majority of slavery is white people being enslaved by non-whites. It seems like mostly Western and European peoples, and not all people, meaning not the person down the street owning slaves, but all of us in Western countries benefiting from some form of slavery in these countries that these economic migrants are coming from. I mean, you can look at NAFTA, for example. Look for a basic example for the number one complaint that American nativists have is that there's some kind of a sinister migration problem coming from Mexico that is completely insidious and occurring in a vacuum of malice, right? The economic migrants from Mexico got fucked by the North American Free Trade Agreement, forcing cheap commodities, for example, like corporatized corn, flooded the Mexican market. And local corn farmers then had to resort to growing marijuana for the cartels because they couldn't afford to compete with this cheap American corn. The ones who didn't stay and farm drugs came here for work because they have skills as day laborers, and a form of economic piracy was committed against their economy by a larger, more powerful majority white nation. And then, additionally, to further add insult to injury, Clinton was a big proponent of the drug war and the spraying of crops of marijuana in Mexico. So no, you can't compete in growing corn, and if you grow anything else, we'll make it impossible for you to get any work in agriculture in your country. But also, don't come here and do our agricultural work. For nothing, by the way. For virtually nothing. So, neoliberal capitalism fucks your economy, or in the case of Muslim migrants, neoconservative warmongering bombs the fuck out of your country. Either imposes or deposes the existing government, and when you run to a Western or European country, they vilify the fuck out of you, even though, for the sake of the Bush Doctrine, they completely annihilated your capacity to make a basic living and survive in your own country. So it really is sort of the catch-22, where the West fucks you twice. They create the need for your migration and then condemn you for migrating. People, as a rule, don't migrate unless they have to. Your average person in a third world country is the same as your average person in a first world country. You want to live and, exist in the community you were born, with the people you grew up around, the kind of small town ethos that exists in those little villages in those third world countries. Those people don't want to leave their friends and family behind, and usually having to leave behind either a husband or a wife and children and come here to work. They are forced by economic circumstances that generally seem to be rooted in some form of neo-colonialism. You cannot victimize someone and then blame them for playing the victim. That's the problem with this true victims talking point, is that we're as Westerners, myself included, I'm shooting this on probably a Chinese-made cell phone. So I'm an active participant in slavery, right? Slave labor. I'm sure that foreign slaves, Indian slaves, sewed my cheap-ass Old Navy t-shirt and my fucking Payless boots. The reason that I can afford to buy a pair of boots for $25 is because workers in another country, Bangladesh or, Pakistan, are getting the screws by the manufacturer. But again, there's a line of causality to migration. It is not a top-down endeavor. It is not it's not ethnic insurgency. And there's so much, nativists have been proven by history to just be impatient. Living in America and studying American history, I know and being the grandson of economic migrants, Latinos from Puerto Rico, I know the hysteria around economic migrants. They're coming to take our jobs. Well, they're going to pay taxes. And even if they don't pay taxes, if an economic migrant comes to your country and they get a job, they can't send every dollar that they make home. They have to survive in the economy they're in. They're going to have to pay rent. They're going to have to buy clothes. They're going to have to buy groceries. So even undocumented immigrants create economic activity. They're not stealing Fortune 500 jobs. And their children are integrating just fine. Like any other group in history that has gone into a multicultural society since Rome. Talk to a third generation immigrant. I mean, look at the hysteria that was wrapped around papism by the largely white Protestant population in the beginning of the 20th century, when migrants were largely Italian, Roman and Irish Catholic. The same talking points that are and at the turn of the century, also at the turn of the last century, Jewish migrants did the same thing that all immigrants do. They came here without a perfect mastery of the language. They moved into communities where people were already, maintaining some portion of their culture, but eventually those communities naturally assimilated. There still are Orthodox Jewish communities. There still are, multiculturalism and assimilation coexist in pluralist societies. I'm not convinced by the historical data that it's an either-or proposition, that you either have a pure ethno-state or you have, forced assimilation. You just have to be patient. Assimilation sometimes happens in one generation, but usually it takes a little longer than that. And we don't want to... I don't think a country loses in pluralism. New York, growing up living in New York, the existing cultural milieu of different foods and languages and music and culture enriches this city and makes it a better place to live. And Lana Lokteff wants to turn America into some kind of a Nordic Viking paradise. Norway's not even like that. It's standard utopianism. It's a promise of a pure nation that has never existed and can never exist. Because the human beings are all a single race, migrating over the same land, all for the same reasons, just in different languages. Looking to survive. The number motivation for migrants is survival, not sexual imperialism.